The spring of 1875 came harsh and unforgiving to the Wyoming Territory, bringing dust instead of rain and a sun that baked the earth until it cracked like old leather. Clara Bennett stepped off the stagecoach at Cedar Ridge, her worn traveling dress heavy with the grime of 3 days' journey. She clutched a small carpet bag containing everything she owned in this world: 2 changes of clothing, a wooden rolling pin wrapped in muslin, and a leather-bound recipe book that had belonged to her mother. The town stretched before her like a collection of weathered bones bleaching in the sun. False-fronted buildings lined the single main street, their unpainted boards silvered with age. Men in dusty clothes watched her arrival with curious eyes. But Clara kept her gaze forward, her spine straight despite the weariness that pulled at her bones. She had answered an advertisement in the Cheyenne newspaper: simple work for honest pay. A rancher needed someone who could bake bread for his ranch hands. No experience with cattle required, just strong hands for kneading and knowledge of a good oven. It seemed like Providence itself when she'd read those words in the dim light of the boarding house where she'd spent her last coins. The memories she'd left behind in Missouri pressed against her thoughts like bruises, but she pushed them away. That life, the life where she'd been someone's wife, where she'd buried dreams along with other precious things, belonged to a different woman. Here, she would be only Clara the baker, nothing more. At the general store, she inquired about the Hartley Ranch. The proprietor, a thin man with suspicious eyes, pointed west, 8 miles out. Jake Hartley's place. You the woman he hired for the kitchen? I am. He'll be along shortly. Always comes to town Saturdays. The man's gaze lingered on her face, searching for gossip fodder. Shame about his wife. 2 winters past now. Left him with the little girl. Clara merely nodded, offering nothing to feed the man's hunger for talk. She'd learned that silence served better than explanations, especially for a woman alone. True to the shopkeeper's word. A wagon pulled up within the hour. The man holding the reins possessed the particular stillness of those who'd known deep loss. Dark hair showed beneath his hat brim, and his hands on the leather were scarred from years of hard work. When he climbed down, he moved with the economy of someone who measured each gesture against the day's remaining strength. Miss Bennett? Yes. He studied her for a moment, taking in her plain dress and practical boots, the lack of frivolity in her appearance. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him. Jake Hartley. Ranch is a fair piece out. You have belongings. Just this. She indicated her carpet bag. Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps surprise at her meager possessions, perhaps approval at their lack. He took the bag without comment and placed it in the wagon bed with unexpected gentleness. The ride passed in near silence. Jake Hartley wasn't a man for idle conversation, and Clara found comfort in that. She watched the landscape unfold: endless grassland broken by distant bluffs, the occasional cluster of cottonwoods marking a creek bed. The sky stretched impossibly wide, making her feel small and somehow cleaner for it. I should tell you about the work, he said eventually, his voice rough from disuse. 15 hands, sometimes 20 during roundup, breakfast before dawn, dinner at sundown, bread daily, biscuits when there's time. The kitchen's separate from the main house. You'll sleep in the room off the back of it. That suits me fine, Mr. Hartley. He glanced at her sideways. Just Jake. We don't stand much on formality out here. A pause, then, there's my daughter, Emma. She's 6. She keeps to herself. Doesn't talk much since her mother passed. You're to leave her be. She takes her meals in the house with me. The warning in his tone was unmistakable. Clara recognized the fierce protectiveness of a father guarding a wounded child. I understand. I hired you for the kitchen work, nothing more? Of course. They crested a low rise, and the ranch spread before them. It wasn't grand, a collection of log buildings arranged around a dusty yard, corrals stretching away to the north, but it was solid, well-maintained. Speaking of hard work and careful management, the main house sat apart, a two-story structure with a porch facing east toward the sunrise. Jake pulled the wagon up beside a long, low building with a chimney at one end. "Kitchen," he said simply. Inside, Clara found a kingdom of cast iron and solid wood. A massive stove dominated one wall, its black surface gleaming with careful maintenance. Shelves held sacks of flour and meal, crocks of lard, tins of saleratus. A long work table scarred from years of use occupied the center of the room. Everything was clean but cheerless, functional without warmth. The men eat at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. They'll expect coffee all day. There's a garden out back hasn't been tended proper, but there might be something salvageable. Root cellars stocked with potatoes and such. Beef when we butcher. Bacon and beans otherwise. He showed her the small room that would be hers, a narrow bed with a corn husk mattress, a washstand, hooks for clothing. A single window looked out toward the main house. "I'll send one of the hands with flour in the morning. Best if you start the bread early, the men like it fresh." He paused at the door, seeming to struggle with something. "My daughter, you'll see her around, but she's not to be bothered. She's had enough upheaval." Clara met his gaze steadily. "I'm here to bake bread. Jake, nothing more." He nodded once, sharply, and left her alone in the gathering dusk. That night, Clara unpacked her few possessions and set her mother's rolling pin on the table like a promise. Through her window, she could see lamplight in the main house, shadows moving behind curtained windows. Somewhere in that house was a motherless child who didn't speak, and a man trying to hold the broken pieces of his family together with nothing but will and work. She understood broken things. She understood the weight of loss that pressed down until breathing became a conscious act. But she also understood that she'd been hired for flour and yeast and fire, not for healing hearts. That was a boundary she would respect, no matter what her own heart might whisper in the small hours of the night. The wind picked up as full dark fell, rattling the windows and sending dust devils dancing across the yard. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and began planning tomorrow's bread. 15 hungry men required 8 loaves at least, maybe 10. She'd need to test the oven's temperament, learn its hot spots and quirks. In the distance, a coyote called, its voice threading through the darkness like a lament. Clara closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. This was her life now, this kitchen, this work, this careful distance from others' pain. It would be enough. It had to be enough. Tomorrow, she would rise before the sun and begin. The rhythm of bread-making became Clara's clock in those first weeks at the Hartley Ranch. She rose at 4 each morning, when the stars still held dominion over the sky, and lit the kitchen stove with practiced efficiency. The sourdough starter she'd begun her second day had taken hold beautifully, bubbling with life in its crock by the warming shelf. By the time the first ranch hands stumbled in for coffee, she had dough rising in bowls covered with damp cloth. The men were respectful but distant, offering gruff nods of appreciation when she set out the previous day's bread with butter and molasses. They spoke of cattle and weather, of broken fences and water levels in the creek, but never of personal things. She moved among them like a ghost, filling coffee cups and clearing plates, as invisible as she wished to be. The bread oven stood separate from the main stove, built into the wall with stones Jake had hauled from the distant hills. Learning its moods took patience. Too hot, and the crust would char while leaving raw dough within. Too cool, and the loaves emerged pale and heavy. But Clara had always understood ovens the way some understood horses, with intuition born of long practice and careful attention. The process consumed her days entirely. Mix, knead, rise, punch down, shape, rise again, bake. 8 loaves in the morning for dinner, 8 more in the afternoon for supper and the next day's breakfast. Her hands grew stronger, her arms more certain in their movements. The familiar ache between her shoulder blades returned, welcome as an old friend. It was on her 10th day that she first noticed the child. Clara was setting loaves to cool on the wooden racks when a flutter of movement caught her eye through the window. A small figure in a faded blue dress stood at the corner of the kitchen building, barely visible, watching. The moment Clara looked directly at her, the child vanished like smoke. Emma, it had to be Jake's daughter. Clara continued her work, carefully not looking toward where the girl had been, but as she shaped the afternoon loaves, she began to hum softly an old song her mother had sung while baking, wordless and gentle. From the corner of her eye, she saw the small figure return, a little closer this time. The next morning, Clara made an extra small loaf, no bigger than a child's hand. She shaped it with extra care, brushing the top with milk to make it shine golden when baked. This she placed on a cloth on the kitchen's back step, then busied herself inside without looking back. When she checked an hour later, the bread was gone. In its place lay a small stone, smooth and river-polished, gray with a white stripe running through its center. Clara picked it up, turned it over in her flour-dusted hands, then set it on the windowsill where it could catch the light. Days passed in this gentle rhythm. Each morning, a small loaf on the step. Each morning, a small treasure left in exchange, a jay's feather brilliant with blue, a handful of yellow flowers wilting in the heat. Once a carved wooden button that looked to have come from a cherished doll's dress. Clara never spoke of these exchanges, never looked directly at the child who crept closer each day. But she began to vary the small loaves, sometimes braiding the dough, sometimes forming it into the shape of a bird or a rabbit. Simple forms that brought a flutter of movement from her silent watcher, almost like laughter suppressed. Jake noticed, of course. She caught him watching from the main house porch one morning as Emma darted away with her prize. His face was unreadable, but he didn't tell Clara to stop. That evening, he lingered after collecting the dinner provisions for the main house. "The bread's been good," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "The men are pleased." "Thank you." He shifted his weight, looking like he wanted to say more. Clara kept her hands busy wiping down the table, giving him space to find his words or leave them unspoken. "She hasn't bothered you?" "No one has bothered me, Jake." He nodded slowly. "Her mother used to bake, not bread so much, but sweet things, cookies, cake for birthdays." His voice roughened. Emma would sit on a stool and watch, covered in flour by the end. Clara's hands stilled on the washcloth. The pain in his voice was raw, unhealed, dangerous as an open wound. She understood the courage it took to speak of the dead, how their names could catch in your throat like fishhooks. "Children remember love in different ways," she said carefully. "Sometimes in the watching, sometimes in the tasting." He looked at her then, truly looked at her for the first time since that initial day. "You've known loss." It wasn't a question. Clara didn't answer it as one. She simply resumed cleaning, and after a moment, Jake left. But something shifted after that conversation. He began stopping by in the evenings after Emma was abed, sitting on the kitchen step while Clara prepared the next day's starters. They rarely spoke, but the silence grew comfortable, companionable even. Sometimes he would whittle, long curls of pine falling to the ground. Sometimes he simply sat, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. One evening, the kitchen stove began smoking badly, the chimney clogged with creosote. Jake worked beside her to clear it, their movements coordinated without need for words, when a shower of soot cascaded down, covering them both in black dust. Clara couldn't suppress a small laugh. Jake's face transformed with surprise. Then something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Haven't heard laughter in this kitchen for a long while," he said softly. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the stove. "I apologize. I know you prefer—" "No," he cut her off, then seemed surprised at his own vehemence. "No, it's good. This place needs more of it." They finished cleaning in silence, but the air between them had changed. charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. The next morning, Clara found Emma closer than ever before, crouched behind the rain barrel only 10 feet from the kitchen door. The child's eyes, Jake's eyes, dark and watchful, peered around the barrel's edge as Clara set out the morning special loaf. On impulse, Clara shaped the dough into a rough heart, pressing her thumb gently into the center before baking. When she set it on the step, she saw Emma lean forward, drawn by this new shape. For just a moment, their eyes met. The child's face held such longing, such terrible loneliness, that Clara's breath caught. Then Emma snatched the bread and fled, but not before Clara glimpsed what might have been the beginning of a smile. That afternoon, beside the stone and feather and button on the windowsill, Clara found a new treasure, a tiny rag doll, no bigger than her thumb, dressed in scraps of the same blue fabric as Emma's dress. She picked it up gently, cradling it in her palm, understanding the trust this offering represented. When Jake came for the evening provisions, his eyes went immediately to the doll in Clara's hand. Something passed over his face, pain, hope, fear, all mixed together. "She made that with her mother," he said quietly. "Last Christmas they had together." Clara placed the doll carefully on the sill with the other treasures. "She's a brave child, to share something so precious." "Brave," Jake repeated, as if tasting the word. Yes, braver than her father, perhaps. The weight of things unsaid hung between them, heavy as bread dough, patient as rising yeast. But Clara had learned that some things couldn't be rushed, that the best bread came from waiting, from letting time and warmth work their quiet magic. Outside, the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and rose. And somewhere between the main house and the kitchen, a little girl clutched a heart-shaped piece of bread and took the first tiny step back toward trust. The morning the kitchen chimney caught fire changed everything. Clara had been rushing, trying to prepare extra loaves for the crew heading out to repair the north pasture fence. The stove, already temperamental from the previous week's troubles, belched black smoke that quickly filled the kitchen. Flames licked up through the chimney pipe, crackling ominously. She grabbed the water bucket, knowing it wouldn't be enough, and shouted for help. The ranch hands came running, Jake at their head, his face tight with concern. They formed a bucket brigade from the well, dousing the flames before they could spread to the roof. In the chaos, no one noticed Emma until it was over. The child stood frozen in the kitchen doorway the first time she'd crossed that threshold since Clara's arrival. Her small face was white with fear, eyes fixed on the blackened stove. "Fire's out," Jake said gently, moving toward his daughter. "Everything's fine. Emma, go back to the house now." But Emma didn't move. Her gaze shifted from the stove to Clara, who stood soot-covered and breathing hard, still clutching an empty bucket. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of shared fears faced and overcome. "The bread," Emma whispered. They were the first words Clara had heard her speak. Clara's heart clenched. The morning special loaf, shaped like a small sun, sat forgotten on the table, covered in ash. "I'll make another," she said softly. Emma took a step into the kitchen, then another. Jake made an abortive movement as if to stop her, but something in Clara's expression held him back. The child approached the ruined loaf, her small fingers hovering over it. "Mama's stove caught fire once," she said, her voice rusty from disuse. "She cried." The ranch hands had melted away, sensing the delicacy of the moment. Only Jake and Clara remained, watching as Emma touched the ash-covered bread with one fingertip. "Fires can be frightening," Clara said carefully, kneeling to bring herself to Emma's level. "But see, we stopped it. Sometimes scary things happen, but we can face them together." Emma looked at her solemnly, then at her father. "You were brave," she told Clara, "like Papa when the wolves came." Jake made a sound half laugh, half sob. quickly suppressed. Clara kept her eyes on Emma, allowing him his privacy. "Would you like to help me make new bread?" Clara asked. "The men will be hungry when they return." Emma bit her lip, a gesture so like her father's that Clara's chest tightened. Then, slowly, the child nodded. What followed was a dance of careful movements and tentative trust. Clara showed Emma how to measure flour, how to proof the yeast until it foamed. The child's hands were quick and clever, needing only one demonstration before copying Clara's movements. Jake remained by the door, silent sentinel, watching his daughter emerge from her shell like a butterfly from a chrysalis. "Mama let me punch down the dough," Emma offered shyly as they waited for the first rise. "Would you like to do that today?" A nod, more confident this time. When the dough had doubled, Clara lifted the cloth and stepped back. Emma approached it like a skittish colt, then plunged her small fists into the pillowy mass with sudden enthusiasm. A giggle escaped her as the dough deflated with a soft whoosh. The sound struck Jake like a physical blow. He turned away, but not before Clara saw the moisture in his eyes. She busied herself with stoking the stove clean now and drawing properly, giving him time to compose himself. They shaped the loaves together, Emma's smaller ones lopsided but made with fierce concentration. Clara showed her how to slash the tops, how to brush them with milk for a golden crust. As they worked, Emma began to talk small things at first. Observations about the dough's texture, questions about why bread rose, but gradually, like a stream finding its course, the words flowed more freely. She spoke of her rag doll, Sarah, and the adventures they had, of the barn cat's new kittens hidden in the hayloft, of dreams where her mother sang lullabies made of bread-scented clouds. Jake had moved from the doorway to a stool by the table, ostensibly repairing a broken bridle, but really watching his daughter bloom under Clara's gentle attention. When Emma laughed again this time at the face Clara made while kneading a particularly stiff batch of dough, his hands stilled on the leather. The ranch hands returned at sunset, tired and dusty, to find fresh bread cooling on the racks, and Emma perched on a high stool, swinging her legs and chattering about the proper temperature for baking. "Well, I'll be," muttered Tom, the eldest of the hands. "Little Miss Emma's found her voice again." The men were careful not to overwhelm her with attention, but Clara noticed how they smiled more that evening, how their voices carried a lighter note. Hope, she realized, was as contagious as sorrow, spreading from one heart to another like fire, but this was a flame that warmed rather than consumed. When it came time for Emma to return to the main house, she hesitated at the kitchen door. "Can I come back tomorrow?" Clara looked at Jake, seeking permission. He cleared his throat, struggling with words. If Miss Clara doesn't mind, I would welcome the help," Clara said simply. Emma beamed a full, radiant smile that transformed her thin face. She skipped across the yard to the main house, turning back twice to wave. Jake lingered, helping Clara clean the kitchen even though it wasn't his custom. They worked in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than before. Fuller somehow, weighted with possibility. "I thought I'd lost her too," he said finally, voice low. "After Margaret died, it was like Emma followed her into that grave. No words, no smiles, just shadow." Clara wrung out a cloth, choosing her words carefully. "Grief takes its own time. Children sometimes need to be sure the world won't end again before they dare to rejoin it." "You sound like you know." She did know. Knew the way loss could steal your voice, your hope, your ability to believe in tomorrow. But that was her burden to carry, not his to hear. "We all have our shadows. Jake." He moved closer, close enough that she could smell the leather and sweat and sunshine that clung to him. "Maybe some shadows are meant to be shared." Her hands stilled. The invitation in his words was clear, but so was the danger. She was here to bake bread, not to complicate an already complex situation. Emma needed stability. not the confusion of her father's growing interest in the hired help. "Emma made wonderful progress today," she said instead, sidestepping the moment. "She has clever hands, quick to learn." Jake studied her face, reading the gentle rejection there. He stepped back, nodding slowly, like her mother that way. An awkwardness settled between them, new and unwelcome. Clara busied herself with banking the stove for the night while Jake gathered Emma's small loaves, misshapen treasures, each one to take to the house. At the door, he paused. "Thank you, for today, he gestured helplessly, "for bringing her back." "She brought herself back," Clara corrected gently. "She just needed to know it was safe to do so." He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Then he was gone, walking across the darkening yard with his daughter's bread cradled careful as eggs in his strong hands. Clara stood in the doorway, watching their windows light up in the main house. Behind one of those windows, a little girl would be showing her father her bread, perhaps planning what shapes to try tomorrow. The thought brought a smile to Clara's lips, even as it twisted something deep in her chest. She had come here to disappear into work, to let the rhythm of bread-making fill the hollow spaces in her heart. She hadn't expected a grieving child's trust or a widowed man's growing regard. Hadn't expected to care about either of them. But life, like bread, rarely rose according to plan. Sometimes the best you could do was tend what was given to you and trust that warmth and time would work their mysterious changes. In the distance, coyotes began their evening chorus, their calls threading through the cooling air. Clara closed the kitchen door and prepared for bed, already planning tomorrow's loaves. Emma had expressed interest in trying a braid. Perhaps they could attempt something more elaborate, a harvest wreath or a wheat sheaf pattern. The very thought of those small, eager hands working alongside hers brought warmth to Clara's chest. Whatever complications might arise, whatever boundaries might blur, she couldn't regret the joy that had returned to Emma Hartley's eyes. Some things were worth the risk of caring again. The afternoon was particularly warm for late spring when Emma arrived at the kitchen carrying something special. She'd been Clara's daily companion for 2 weeks now, her confidence growing with each loaf they shaped together. But today, she clutched a worn cloth bag against her chest, her eyes bright with excitement and something else, a touch of nervousness. "What have you brought?" Clara asked, wiping her floury hands on her apron. Emma set the bag on the table with careful reverence. "Mama's cookie cutters. Papa said I could, if you don't mind." Clara's heart squeezed. Through the cloth, she could feel the shapes of tin cutters, probably passed down through generations. "I would be honored to use them with you." They were making a special batch of sweetened bread dough, enriched with eggs and a precious bit of sugar Jake had brought from town. Emma had requested something fancy for her father's birthday, though Jake didn't know she remembered the date. As Emma unwrapped the cutters, stars, and hearts, horses and flowers, she began to tell Clara about each one. This star was Grandmama's. She brought it from Ohio. And the horse, Papa made that one for Mama when they were courting. He wasn't very good at it, see how the legs are crooked. But Mama said that made it more special. They worked the dough together, rolling it smooth and cutting careful shapes. Emma's concentration was complete, her small pink tongue poking out as she pressed each cutter down. Clara watched her with growing fondness, this child who was slowly unfurling like a flower in sunshine. "Tell me about your mama," Emma said suddenly, not looking up from her work. "Did she bake?" Clara's hand stilled for just a moment. "Yes, she taught me everything I know about bread." "Where is she now?" "She died when I was not much older than you." Emma looked up then, her dark eyes solemn. "Did you stop talking too?" The question was so direct, so perceptive, that Clara couldn't dissemble. For a while, yes, words seemed too heavy to carry. "But you talk now?" "I do, when I found the right words again, and the right people to share them with." Emma considered this as she carefully lifted a dough star onto the baking sheet. "I think you and Papa are right people for words." Before Clara could respond to this pronouncement, Emma had moved on to cutting horse shapes, chattering about how her father's horse, Dusty, liked to steal apples from her pockets. The child's resilience continually amazed Clara, the way she could touch on grief and then dance away, like a butterfly sampling flowers. They were sliding the first batch into the oven when it happened. Emma reached for a high shelf where Clara kept the vanilla extract, stretching on her tiptoes. The stool wobbled, tipped, and suddenly she was falling. Clara lunged forward, catching the child before she hit the floor, but not before Emma's elbow connected sharply with the corner of the table. The little girl's shriek of pain and fright pierced the air. Jake burst through the door moments later, wild-eyed with panic. He'd been working with a green colt in the near corral when he heard his daughter's cry. "What happened, Emma?" "She fell from the stool," Clara said quickly, still cradling the sobbing child. "Her elbow—" Jake was across the room in 2 strides, gathering Emma into his arms. She buried her face in his chest, crying harder now that her father was there, over her head. Jake's eyes met Clara's, and she saw naked fear there, the terror of a man who'd already lost too much. "Let me see. Sweetheart," he murmured, gently examining Emma's elbow. It was already swelling, angry red, but when he carefully bent and straightened it, nothing seemed broken. "Just a bad bump, I think." Clara had already fetched a cold cloth from the water bucket. "Here." Their hands brushed as Jake took the cloth, and Emma, feeling the careful ministrations of both adults, began to calm. Her sobs quieted to hiccups, then sniffles. "It hurts," she whimpered. "I know, baby," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "We'll fix it up." Clara watched them, father and daughter, clinging to each other, and felt like an intruder. She turned to check the oven, giving them privacy, but Emma's voice stopped her. "Don't go, Miss Clara, the cookies." "The cookies will be fine," Clara assured her. "Your papa's here now?" But Emma shook her head, reaching out with her good arm. "Both. I want both." Jake looked at Clara over his daughter's head, something vulnerable and pleading in his expression. Slowly, Clara moved closer, until she was part of their small circle. Emma grabbed her hand, holding tight. They stayed that way for several minutes, Jake holding his daughter, Emma gripping Clara's hand, the kitchen filled with the warm scent of baking and the quiet comfort of shared presence. It felt dangerously like family, treacherously, like belonging. Finally, Emma pulled back, wiping her nose with her sleeve in a gesture that made Jake wince and Clara hide a smile. "The cookies need to come out," she announced with the certainty of a child whose crisis had passed. Clara removed the sheets from the oven while Jake settled Emma at the table with her arm properly wrapped. The shapes had baked perfectly golden stars and horses and hearts that filled the kitchen with sweetness. "They're beautiful," Jake said softly, and Clara wasn't entirely sure he was talking about the cookies. Emma insisted on decorating them despite her injury, using her left hand to sprinkle precious sugar over the warm shapes. She assigned each one this star for Tom because he taught her to whistle, that horse for young Ben who let her help brush the Remuda, a heart for her father, and another heart. "This one's for you, Miss Clara," Emma said shyly, "because you came and made everything better." Clara's throat tightened. She looked at the child-shaped heart, imperfect and precious, and felt her carefully maintained walls crack a little more. "Thank you," she managed. Jake cleared his throat. "Emma, why don't you take some of these to the barn? I'm sure the hands would appreciate them." "But my arm seems to be working fine now," he observed dryly, watching as she'd been using it to arrange cookies. Emma grinned, caught out, and carefully packed a basket with treats. She scampered out, calling back, "Don't eat all the hearts." Suddenly, alone, Clara and Jake stood in awkward silence. The kitchen felt smaller, the air charged with unspoken words. "Thank you," Jake said finally, for catching her, for—" He gestured helplessly. "She's everything to me, Clara, everything." "I know." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, the way his hair curled slightly at his collar. Do you know what it means? Having her laugh again, having her excited about tomorrow." "Jake." "She loves you." The words came out rough, desperate. "And I—" He stopped himself, jaw clenching. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "She's a wonderful child. Anyone would grow fond of her." "That's not what I'm talking about, and you know it." She did know it, had known it in the way he lingered in the evenings, the way his eyes followed her movements, the careful distance he maintained that spoke of want barely leashed. "I'm your employee," she said quietly. "I'm here to bake bread." "Is that all?" His voice dropped low, urgent. "Is that all you want to be?" Before she could answer, before she could decide what answer to give, Emma burst back through the door. "Papa Ben says thank you, and could we make more tomorrow? And also, there's a rider coming. Looks like Mr. Jameson from town." The spell broke. Jake stepped back, the rancher's mask sliding back into place. "I'll go see what he needs." He left quickly, Emma bouncing after him, and Clara was alone with cooling cookies and a heart beating too fast. She pressed her palms against the work table, trying to ground herself in the solid wood and familiar textures of her kitchen. But even the simple act of cleaning up held new weight. The cookies Emma had made for her father sat on a special plate, arranged with childish care. Heart shapes made by small hands that were learning to trust again, to create instead of only grieve. Through the window, she watched Jake greet the rider from town. He moved with his usual economy, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing back toward the kitchen. Emma danced around them, animated and bright, showing off her wrapped arm like a badge of honor. Clara touched the heart-shaped cookie Emma had designated as hers. The child's words echoed, "Because you came and made everything better." But had she? Or had she complicated a situation that needed simplicity? She'd come here to disappear into work, not to become essential to a broken family trying to heal, not to feel her own heart stirring with dangerous wants. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting the kitchen golden. In the oven, another batch of cookies baked, filling the air with promises of sweetness. And somewhere between flour and grief, between careful distance and a child's laughter, Clara felt the terrifying pull of hope. She'd thought herself done with such feelings, had buried them with other precious things. But life, it seemed, had other plans. Just like Emma's crooked horse cutter. Sometimes the imperfect shapes were the most special because they were real, because they were brave enough to exist despite their flaws. The timer chimed, calling her back to the present. There was bread to make for supper, cookies to finish, a kitchen to set to rights. But as Clara worked, she found herself humming the same wordless tune her mother had sung, now carrying new meaning in this place where broken hearts were learning to beat again. Tomorrow, Emma would return with her quick hands and quicker smile. Jake would linger in the doorway, saying too much with his silences, and Clara would continue walking the delicate line between employee and something more, between safety and the terrifying possibility of happiness. For now, though, there was bread to bake, and in the rhythm of kneading and shaping, she found a kind of peace fragile as spun sugar, precious as a child's trust, warm as fresh-baked hearts cooling on a scarred wooden table. The man appeared on a Tuesday afternoon like a bad memory given form. Clara was teaching Emma how to braid dough when the kitchen door darkened. She looked up, expecting one of the ranch hands, but the figure standing there was unfamiliar tall, well-dressed in clothes too fine for ranch work, with pale eyes that swept over her with proprietary satisfaction. "Hello, Clara." Her hands stilled on the dough. Blood rushed in her ears as recognition hit her like a physical blow. Richard Thornton, the man she'd fled Missouri to escape. "You know this man, Miss Clara, Emma asked, shrinking closer to Clara's side, child's instincts alert to danger. Richard's smile widened, not pleasantly. Oh yes, little girl, Clara and I are old. Friends, very old friends. His emphasis on the word made Clara's skin crawl. Emma, Clara said, surprised at how steady her voice sounded. Please go find your father. Tell him we have a visitor. But the bread. Now, Emma. The child must have heard something in Clara's tone because she slipped out the back door without further protest, casting worried glances over her shoulder. Richard stepped fully into the kitchen, his presence filling the space like smoke. You've led me quite a chase, my dear St. Louis, Cheyenne, and now this rustic establishment. What do you want, Richard? What I've always wanted. What was promised to me before you took these foolish notions into your head. He moved closer, and Clara backed against the work table. Your father and I had an agreement. His debt's for your hand. Just because he's dead doesn't dissolve that contract. I owe you nothing. His face hardened. You owe me everything. Do you think you could just disappear? Leave me to explain to everyone how my intended bride vanished in the night? He grabbed her wrist, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. You've humiliated me. Clara, that requires compensation. Let go of me! Or what, you'll run again. There's nowhere left to run. His grip tightened. I've come to collect what's mine. You can come quietly, or I can make things very unpleasant for this quaint little ranch. I'm sure the owner would be interested to know he's been harboring a woman who breaks legal contracts, who fled her obligations. I said, let her go. Jake's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade. He stood in the doorway, every line of his body radiating controlled violence. Emma peered around him, eyes wide. Richard released Clara's wrist but didn't step back. Ah, you must be the employer, Mr. Hartley. I believe Richard Thornton, from St. Louis. I've come to retrieve my wayward fiancé. I'm not your fiancé, Clara said firmly. The lady seems to disagree with your assessment, Jake said, moving into the kitchen. His movements were deceptively casual, but Clara recognized the predatory grace of a man ready for violence. Richard's smile turned condescending. I have documents that say otherwise. A legal contract signed by her father. She's bound to me by law. Emma, go to the house, Jake said quietly. Papa. Now. The child fled. Jake moved closer, positioning himself between Clara and Richard. Mr. Thornton, I think you should leave. Not without what I came for. Richard's veneer of civility was cracking. That woman belongs to me. Her father sold her to cover his gambling debts. She has no right to refuse. Sold her. Jake's voice was dangerously flat. Like property. A business arrangement. Quite common, really, and legally binding. Clara found her voice. My father had no right to promise what wasn't his to give. I'm not cattle to be bartered. Richard's face flushed. You'll watch your tongue, woman. You've caused me considerable trouble and expense. You'll come back with me now, and we'll say no more about your indiscretions here. He reached for her again, but Jake's hand shot out, catching Richard's wrist in an iron grip. Touch her again, Jake said softly, and I'll kill you where you stand. Richard jerked free, rage twisting his features. You dare threaten me, I'll have the law in this place. I'll see you ruined. Hartley, you and this, he gestured dismissively at Clara. This runaway who's been warming your bed, no doubt, playing house with your brat while bound to another man. The insult to Emma broke Jake's control. His fist connected with Richard's jaw with a sound like an axe hitting wood. Richard staggered back, blood streaming from his nose. You broke my nose, he shrieked, pulling out a handkerchief. You'll pay for this, you savage! Jake advanced on him, and Richard scrambled backward. Get off my land, now, If I see you again, if you come near Clara or my daughter again, I'll bury you out on the prairie where no one will ever find you." Richard's eyes darted between them, calculating. Then he straightened his jacket with shaking hands. "This isn't over. I have legal rights. I'll be back with the sheriff." "You do that?" Jake said grimly. "Sheriff Watson's a reasonable man. I'm sure he'll be real interested in your business arrangement. Real interested in a man who thinks he can buy and sell women like horses." Richard backed toward the door, still pressing the handkerchief to his nose. "You've made a mistake. Hartley, both of you. I don't forget debts owed." He left, and they could hear his horse's hooves pounding away at a gallop. Clara sagged against the table, her legs suddenly weak. Jake turned to her, his face tight with concern. "Did he hurt you?" She looked at her wrist, already showing the marks of Richard's grip. Jake cursed softly, taking her hand with infinite gentleness, examining the bruises. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered. "I'm so sorry. I never meant to bring trouble to your door. I'll leave." "Like hell you will." The vehemence in his voice startled her. "Jake, you don't understand. He won't give up. He's rich, connected. He can make trouble for the ranch, for you, for Emma. Let him try." Jake's thumb brushed over her wrist, feather light over the bruises. "Clara, look at me." She raised her eyes to his, seeing fierce protectiveness there, and something else, something that made her heart race. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "Not because of him, not because of anyone. You belong here." "I'm just the hired help." "Stop." He cupped her face in his hands, rough thumbs gentle against her cheeks. "You know that's not true. You haven't been just anything since the day Emma first smiled at your bread, since you brought life back to this place." "Jake." "I won't let him take you. I won't let anyone—" His voice broke. "I can't lose you too. Clara, Emma can't. We need you." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "I've brought danger to your home. You've brought joy back to it. Everything else, we'll handle." A small sound from the doorway made them both turn. Emma stood there, tears streaming down her face. "Are you leaving, Miss Clara, because of that bad man?" Clara pulled away from Jake and knelt, opening her arms. Emma flew into them, sobbing. "Please don't go," the child wept. "Please, I'll be better. I'll help more with the bread. I won't complain about needing. Please don't leave us." "Oh, sweetheart." Clara held her close, her own eyes burning. "I'm not leaving because of you. You're perfect just as you are." "Then why?" Emma pulled back, searching Clara's face. "Is it because of what he said about papers and owing?" Clara struggled for words to explain adult cruelties to a child who'd already known too much loss. Jake knelt beside them. "Sometimes, Emma, bad people try to make others do things they don't want to do. That man wanted to take Miss Clara away, but we're not going to let that happen. Promise." Emma looked between them, desperate for reassurance. "I promise," Jake said firmly. Emma turned to Clara. "You promise too?" Clara hesitated, knowing the danger of promises, the weight of a child's trust, but looking at Emma's tear-stained face, at Jake's determined expression, she felt something shift inside her chest, a door long barred cracking open. "I promise to try my very best to stay," she said carefully. "And to be honest with you both, always." Emma considered this with a seriousness children brought to important matters. Then she nodded. "And we'll protect you. Papa's strong, and I can help. I can watch for that bad man." "No," Jake said sharply. "You stay away from him if he comes back. You run and get help. Understand?" Emma nodded solemnly. The three of them stayed there on the kitchen floor, holding each other, while bread dough rose forgotten on the table and afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor. Finally, Jake stood, lifting Emma with him. Why don't you go check on the barn cats, make sure they're all right after the commotion?" Emma looked reluctant to leave, but obeyed. When she was gone, Jake turned to Clara, who had risen and was absently shaping the over-risen dough. "Tell me about him. Everything." So Clara did, her hands working the dough as she spoke, about her father's gambling, the mounting debts, the night he'd come home and announced he'd found a solution, about Richard Thornton's possession masquerading as courtship, his rage when she'd refused him, about the night she'd fled with nothing but what she could carry, knowing he would follow, but hoping to disappear into the vastness of the frontier. "He has no legal claim," Jake said when she finished. "No legitimate court would uphold a father selling his daughter to pay gambling debts. You don't know Richard. He has ways of making things seem legitimate, and he doesn't like to lose. Neither do I." The quiet steel in Jake's voice made her look up. "This isn't your fight." "Isn't it?" He moved closer. "Clara, do you really not understand? Do you not see what you mean to this family, to me?" Her hand stilled on the dough. "Jake, I've been dead inside since Margaret passed, just going through the motions, keeping the ranch running, trying to hold Emma together while falling apart myself. Then you came, and suddenly there was bread rising and laughter in my kitchen and my daughter talking again, and He stopped, running a hand through his hair in frustration. I started remembering what it felt like to be alive. The words hung between them, an admission that changed everything and nothing all at once. "I won't be the cause of more pain in this house," Clara said quietly. "You've both survived too much already." "And you haven't?" He caught her hand, stilling her nervous kneading. "Clara, we're all survivors here, but maybe it's time to stop just surviving and start living again." She looked at their joined hands, his sun dark and scarred, hers pale with flour, and felt the last of her defenses crumble. "I'm frightened." "So am I. But I'm more frightened of losing what we're building here." Outside, Emma's voice drifted from the barn, talking to the cats in the sweet tone children reserved for small creatures. Normal sounds of a ranch at day's end filled the air horses' nickering, cowboys calling to each other, the whisper of wind through grass. But inside the kitchen, the world had shifted on its axis. "We'll face whatever comes," Jake said, "together, if you'll have us." Clara thought of Richard's threats, of the trouble he could bring, but she also thought of Emma's laughter, of morning bread and evening conversations, of the way this place had begun to feel like home. Sometimes the greatest courage was not in running, but in choosing to stand and fight for what mattered. "Together," she agreed softly. Jake smiled then, the first full smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his weathered face into something almost boyish. Still holding her hand, he helped her shape the dough into loaves, working beside her as naturally as if they'd been doing it for years. Whatever storm Richard Thornton brought, they would weather it. A man who saw women as property to be owned had no understanding of the fierce protectiveness of those who'd learned to see them as people to be cherished. And Clara, who had run so far and so long, finally felt the ground steady beneath her feet. The week following Richard's visit passed intense vigilance. Jake had the ranch hands take turns watching the road, and he himself rarely strayed far from the kitchen area. Clara went about her work, but every hoofbeat made her heart race. Every unfamiliar voice sent fear skittering down her spine. It was young Ben who spotted them first, Richard returning with two other men, one wearing a sheriff's star. The alarm went up across the ranch, and by the time the trio reached the main yard, Jake was waiting, flanked by several of his men. "Sheriff Watson," Jake nodded to the lawman, a grizzled veteran Clara had seen in town. "Mr. Thornton, gentlemen." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Jake, this fellow's made some serious accusations. Says you're harboring a woman who broke a legal contract and that you assaulted him." "I defended a woman in my employ from unwanted advances," Jake replied evenly. "As for contracts, I'd be interested to see any document that claims ownership of a free person." Richard produced a paper with a flourish. Signed and witnessed. Her father's debt ledger and his promise of his daughter's hand in payment. Sheriff Watson examined the document, his frown deepening. This is irregular. It's perfectly legal, Richard insisted. A father has the right to arrange his daughter's marriage. In some places, maybe, the sheriff said slowly. But this is Wyoming territory. Mr. Thornton, we do things different here. Clara had been watching from the kitchen doorway. Emma clutched against her side. Now she stepped forward, despite Jake's gesture to stay back. Sheriff Watson, she said clearly, that paper was signed under duress. My father owed Mr. Thornton gambling debts. When he couldn't pay, Mr. Thornton demanded me his payment. I refused and left of my own free will. She had no right, Richard began hotly. I had every right, Clara interrupted. I'm not property to be bartered. And even if such contracts were valid here, which I doubt they are, my father died 2 months ago. Any debts died with him. Richard's face went white, then red. You're lying. I have the death certificate, Clara said quietly. From St. Louis, consumption took him in March. She'd kept the paper hidden in her few possessions, a final tie to a life she'd fled. Now she retrieved it, handing it to the sheriff with steady hands. Sheriff Watson studied it, then looked at Richard with considerably less sympathy. Seems to me this matter's settled. The lady's free to make her own choices, and she's chosen to work here. This is outrageous, Richard sputtered. I've spent considerable money tracking her down. I demand satisfaction. Only satisfaction you're getting is a peaceful departure. Jake said coldly. Unless you'd prefer I press charges for assault. My daughter witnessed you grab Miss Bennett hard enough to leave marks. Your daughter? Richard's eyes glittered with malice. Yes, the little brat who... He never finished the sentence. Jake moved so fast Clara barely saw it. One moment he was standing still. The next, he had Richard by the throat, lifted nearly off his feet. Jake, Sheriff Watson barked. Put him down! Jake held on a moment longer, his face inches from Richard's. Speak of my daughter again, he said very softly, and they'll never find your body. He released Richard, who staggered back, gasping. The sheriff stepped between them. That's enough, Mr. Thornton. I suggest you return to wherever you came from. There's nothing for you here. This isn't over, Richard wheezed, but he was already backing toward his horse. You haven't heard the last of this. They watched him ride away, his hired companions trailing behind. Sheriff Watson lingered, studying Clara with kind eyes. You all right, Miss? Yes, Sheriff, thank you. He nodded, then turned to Jake. He strikes me as the type to hold grudges. Watch yourself. We will. After the sheriff left, a strange hush fell over the ranch. The hands dispersed to their duties, but Clara could feel their protective watchfulness. She returned to the kitchen on shaking legs, Emma still pressed against her side. Is he really gone? Emma whispered. For now, sweetheart. Jake followed them in, his face still tight with controlled fury. Emma, why don't you go gather the eggs? The hens will be wondering where you are. Emma looked between them, then squeezed Clara's hand. He won't take you. We won't let him. After she left, Clara sank onto a stool, the strength draining from her limbs. I should have told you about my father, about the debt. Would it have changed anything? Jake asked. She considered this. No, I still would have run, still would have answered your advertisement. Then it doesn't matter. He moved closer, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. Clara, what matters is that you're here now, that you're safe. Am I? She looked up at him. He won't give up easily. Men like Richard, they don't like being denied. Let him come. This ranch has weathered worse than one entitled Peacock from St. Louis. Despite everything, Clara found herself almost smiling at the description. Peacock. Did you see those clothes? Man probably can't even saddle his own horse. Jake's attempt at lightness faded. But you're right. He'll try something else. As if to underscore his words, that night brought trouble. Clara woke to the acrid smell of smoke and the sound of shouting. She rushed outside to find the hay barn ablaze, flames reaching toward the star-filled sky. The ranch hands formed bucket brigades, fighting desperately to keep the fire from spreading to the other buildings. Jake appeared at her side, soot-streaked and grim. "Get Emma," he ordered. "Keep her in the house." Clara ran, finding the child standing on the porch in her nightgown, eyes wide with terror. "It's all right," Clara soothed, though her own heart hammered. "Come inside." They watched from the window as the men fought the flames. Emma pressed against Clara, trembling. "Is it the bad man?" Clara wanted to lie, to protect her, but she'd promised honesty. "I don't know. Maybe." "Because of us. Because Papa protected you." "Oh, sweetheart." Clara pulled her close. "Bad people do bad things because that's who they are, not because of anything we did." The fire was contained before it could spread, but the hay barn was a total loss. As dawn broke, Jake returned to the house, exhausted and filthy. Emma flew into his arms. "We're all right," he assured her. "Everyone's safe." Over Emma's head, his eyes met Clara's. She read the truth there. This was no accident. Richard had struck back in the cowardly way of his kind, from the shadows. The next days brought a new tension. Jake hired extra men to patrol at night. Clara found herself checking windows, starting at shadows. Even Emma grew quieter, watchful in the way of children who sense adult fears. It was almost a relief when Richard appeared again, this time alone, riding up to the kitchen door where Clara was teaching Emma to make pie crust. "Don't come any closer," Clara warned, her hand going to the rolling pin. Richard dismounted but stayed by his horse. His fine clothes were dusty, his face haggard. "I've come to make you a final offer." "I want nothing from you. Not even freedom," he smiled thinly. "Leave with me now, quietly, and I'll forget this whole incident. The fire was just a warning. Next time could be worse. The house, perhaps, with people inside." Clara's blood ran cold. Emma made a small sound of fear. "You're threatening a child." Clara's voice shook with rage. "I'm being practical. You've caused me considerable trouble, Clara. Time, money, reputation. But I'm willing to forgive all that if you just see sense." "Get off this land." Jake's voice came from behind them. He stood in the doorway, rifle in hand. "Now." Richard's hand twitched toward his coat. "I wouldn't," Jake said softly. "I'm a very good shot." "You can't guard her forever," Richard said. "One way or another. I'll have satisfaction. She owes me." "She owes you nothing," Jake said. "But you owe me a barn." Richard's laugh was ugly. "Prove it was me." "I don't need to prove anything. This is my land, my family, my woman." Jake's voice carried absolute conviction. "You come here again, you threaten them again, and law or no law, I'll end you." Something in Jake's face must have convinced him. Richard paled, backing toward his horse. "This isn't over." "Yes," Clara said suddenly, stepping forward. "It is." Both men looked at her. She stood straight, no longer the frightened woman who'd fled in the night. "I'm done running from you, Richard. Done being afraid. You have no power over me anymore." "We'll see about that," he blustered, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "No, we won't." Clara moved closer, Jake's presence giving her strength. "Because if you come back, if you threaten this family again, I'll tell everyone the truth. About your debts, your failures, the real reason you needed my father's money so badly." Richard went very still. "You wouldn't dare." "I know about the embezzlement. Richard, my father told me before he died how much you stole from your partners, how desperately you needed that marriage to hide your crimes behind respectability." She smiled coldly. Leave now, and your secrets stay buried. Come back, and I'll write to every newspaper from here to St. Louis." The silence stretched taut. Richard's face cycled through rage, fear, calculation. Finally, he mounted his horse with stiff movements. "You've made your choice," he said. "Live with it." He rode away. And this time, somehow, Clara knew he wouldn't return. The threat she'd held in reserve, the knowledge her father had whispered in his final fevered days, had been her last card to play, and it had worked. Jake lowered the rifle, looking at her with something like awe. Embezzlement. Everything he accused my father of, he was guilty of himself. He needed a respectable wife to shore up his crumbling reputation. She shrugged. "I was convenient." Emma tugged at her skirt. "Is he really gone forever?" Clara knelt, taking the child's flour-dusted hands. "I believe so." "Good." Emma's fierce expression was pure Hartley. "He was mean, and he scared you. I don't like people who scare you." "Oh, my brave girl." Clara hugged her close, feeling Jake's hand come to rest on her shoulder. Completing their circle, they stood there in the kitchen doorway, flour dust dancing in the morning light, the scent of smoke still lingering in the air. They'd survived fire and threats, fear and confrontation. Richard Thornton had tried to tear apart what they were building, but he'd only succeeded in revealing its strength. "Mama!" Emma's voice was small, tentative. Clara froze. The child had never called her that before. She looked up at Jake, seeing her own wonder reflected in his eyes. "I mean, Miss Clara, Emma stumbled over the words, suddenly uncertain. "It's all right," Clara whispered. "You can call me whatever feels right to you." Emma bit her lip, then nodded. "Mama," she said again, more firmly, "the pie dough is ready." Clara blinked back tears. "So it is, sweetheart, so it is." They went back inside together, leaving the morning sun to chase away the last shadows of fear. There would be time later to rebuild what was lost, to strengthen what remained. But for now, there was pie to make, and a child who'd found her way to a new mother's heart, and a man whose steady presence had become as necessary as breath. The kitchen filled with normal sounds, the scratch of fork on dough, Emma's chatter about which berries made the best filling, Jake's quiet movements as he helped clean up the flour Emma had enthusiastically scattered. It was domestic and simple and more precious than any fortune. Clara had fled west seeking escape. What she'd found was a home, a family, a life worth fighting for. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. Not that she'd defeated Richard Thornton, but that she'd discovered something worth standing her ground to protect. The summer heat had settled over the ranch like a wool blanket, making the kitchen work even more challenging. Clara had taken to starting her baking at 3 in the morning, finishing before the worst of the day's heat. It had been 2 months since Richard's last visit, and life had found a new rhythm, one that included Emma calling her Mama as naturally as breathing. Jake had been different lately, quieter, more thoughtful, often catching her eye across the yard with an expression she couldn't quite read. He'd taken to wearing his good shirt more often, the one usually reserved for town visits. Tom, the eldest ranch hand, had teased him about it until Jake's glare silenced him. This particular evening, after Emma had been tucked into bed in the main house, she'd been sleeping there less and less. Preferring to help Mama close the kitchen, Jake lingered in the doorway. Clara was wiping down the work table, aware of his presence but giving him time to find his words. "Clara." She turned, dishcloth in hand. He was holding something behind his back, and there was a vulnerability in his face she'd never seen before. "I need to show you something," he said. "Will you walk with me?" She set aside the cloth and untied her apron. Together they stepped into the cooling evening air. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that only the prairie could produce. Jake led her away from the buildings to a small rise that overlooked the ranch. "Margaret and I used to come here," he said quietly. "When we were courting, when we needed to talk about important things." Clara waited, sensing the weight of what was coming. "I loved her," Jake continued. "Want you to know that she was a good woman, a good mother. When she died, I thought—" He cleared his throat. "I thought that part of my life was over, that I'd had my chance at happiness and lost it." "Jake, let me finish, please." He turned to face her fully. "These past months, watching you with Emma, seeing how you've brought life back to this place. Clara, you've given me something I never thought I'd have again. Hope." He brought his hand from behind his back. In his palm lay a small, worn box. "This was my mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold ring set with a tiny pearl. "She gave it to me before she died, told me to give it to the woman who would help me build a life worth living." Clara's breath caught. "Jake!" "I know I'm not much of a catch," he rushed on. "A widower with a child. A ranch that's more work than profit most years. And I know you've been hurt. That trusting doesn't come easy. But Clara Bennett, I love you. Not because you bake bread or care for Emma. Though God knows I'm grateful for both. I love you because you're strong and kind and brave. Because you stood up to that bastard Thornton. Because you hum when you're happy and bite your lip when you're thinking, and because you've made this place a home again." He dropped to one knee on the prairie grass, holding up the ring. "Will you marry me? Will you be my wife? Emma's mother. Not just in practice, but in truth." Clara's eyes burned with tears. She thought of all the reasons to say no the short time they'd known each other. The gossiping tongues in town. The shadow of his first marriage. Then she thought of mornings in the kitchen with Emma's laughter. Evenings on the step with Jake's quiet presence. The way his hand felt when it brushed hers over the breadboard. "I'm not Margaret," she said softly. "No," he agreed. "You're Clara, and that's who I'm asking to marry me. Not a replacement, not a substitute. You." She looked at the ring, small and simple and perfect. "The ranch hands will talk." "Let them. The women in town will say you're marrying your kitchen help." They'd be right. The best kitchen help in the territory, who also happens to be the woman I love. "Emma already asked me when I was going to make you her real mama," Jake admitted with a small smile. "Told me I was being terrible slow about it and threatened to propose for me if I didn't hurry up." That startled a laugh from Clara, picturing Emma's determined little face. "She did not." "She did. This morning, while you were at the well. Said she'd already picked out where you should stand for the wedding right by the kitchen door, so the bread smell would make everything perfect." Clara was crying now, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Jake Hartley, are you proposing to me with your 6-year-old daughter's blessing and planning? Is it working?" She knelt in the grass beside him, taking his weathered face between her hands. "You beautiful, wonderful fool. Yes, yes, I'll marry you." His kiss was everything their careful courtship hadn't allowed, deep and desperate and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, he slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands. "It's too small," he said apologetically as it stuck at her knuckle. "It's perfect," Clara corrected, working it over with determination. "Like everything else about this family, it just needs a little patience and faith." They walked back to the ranch hand in hand, the ring catching the last rays of sunlight. Clara expected to feel different, transformed somehow by this promise. Instead, she felt a deep rightness, as if puzzle pieces had finally clicked into place. Emma was supposed to be asleep, but was predictably watching from her window. The moment she saw them, she came flying out in her nightgown, bare feet slapping against the porch boards. "Did you ask? Did she say yes? Can I see the ring?" The questions tumbled out in an excited rush. Jake scooped her up. "Yes, yes, and yes, little magpie." Emma examined Clara's hand with satisfaction. "Grandma's ring. Papa said she was particular about who wore it, said it would only fit someone special. And what do you think? Clara asked. Does it fit? Emma's arms came around her neck in a fierce hug. It's perfect, Mama, just like you. Over the child's head, Clara met Jake's eyes, seeing her wonder reflected there. How had this happened? How had a desperate flight from an unwanted future led to this a ready-made family? A home, a love she hadn't dared dream of finding. Word spread through the ranch with the speed of prairie fire. By breakfast, every hand knew. And Clara found herself blushing under their knowing grins and congratulations. Tom produced a hidden bottle of whiskey for toasting, and even taciturn Ben managed a smile and a muttered, "About time." When? Emma demanded over breakfast. Tomorrow I can wear my blue dress, the one with flowers. These things take time to plan, Clara began, but Jake interrupted. Why wait? He asked. We could ride to town today, talk to Reverend Mills. Today? Clara's hands fluttered to her hair, her worn dress. But we haven't. You're perfect, Jake said firmly, just as you are. But if you want time. She thought about it. Thought about waiting, planning, preparing. Then thought about Richard's threats, about how quickly life could change, about Margaret who'd had years with Jake but still not enough. Emma, she said, go get your blue dress. The child whooped and ran for the house. Jake's face split into a grin that made him look years younger. You're sure? He asked. Clara stood, went to him, framed his face with flowery hands. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. They were married that afternoon in the small church in town. Emma standing between them holding a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked along the way. Sheriff Watson served as witness, grinning broadly, while Mrs. Patterson from the general store played the pump organ with more enthusiasm than skill. It wasn't the wedding Clara had once imagined, back when she was young and her father's promises hadn't yet turned to ash. There was no white dress, no feast, no gathering of family. But as Jake slipped a simple gold band on her finger, bought it months ago, he admitted sheepishly. Been carrying it around hoping she knew this was better than any girlish dream. This was real. This was chosen. This was theirs. I now pronounce you man and wife. Reverend Mills intoned, You may kiss your bride. Jake did, thoroughly, while Emma giggled and the witnesses applauded. And if Mrs. Mills sniffed about the unseemly haste of it all, well, her opinion mattered less than the joy on Emma's face or the love in Jake's eyes. They returned to the ranch as the sun was setting, to find the hands had prepared a surprise. Lanterns hung from the porch rails, and a table had been set up in the yard laden with food nothing fancy, just good ranch fare, but prepared with care. A fiddle appeared from somewhere, and soon music filled the evening air. Dance with me, Mrs. Hartley, Jake requested formally. Mrs. Hartley. Clara tested the name in her mind and found it fit perfectly, like a ring size just right. They danced in the dusty yard, Emma between them, while the stars came out overhead and the ranch hands clapped time. It was unconventional and impromptu and absolutely perfect. Later, after Emma had been put to bed in the main house, You live there now too. Mama, your room is next to mine. Jake and Clara stood on the porch, watching the lanterns flicker in the breeze. No regrets, he asked. Clara twisted the ring on her finger, thinking of the long road that had led her here. The pain, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it had brought her to this moment, this man, this life. Not one, she said, and meant it. He pulled her close, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be bread to bake and a ranch to run and a daughter to raise. There would be those who questioned their quick marriage, who whispered about the propriety of it all. But tonight, Clara Hartley was exactly where she belonged in the arms of a man who'd given her his mother's ring not as payment or possession, but as a promise of partnership, of shared purpose, of love that grew from ordinary moments into something extraordinary. "Welcome home," Jake murmured against her hair. And Clara, who had run so far seeking safety, finally understood that home wasn't a place, but a choice to stay, to trust, to love. A choice sealed with flower-dusted hands and a pearl ring and the laughter of a child who called her Mama. "Yes," she whispered back. Home. 1 year later, the Hartley Ranch kitchen had become something of a marvel in Cedar Ridge. What had once been a simple workspace for feeding ranch hands had transformed into a gathering place where magic happened daily, the magic of bread rising, of children learning, of community growing. Clara stood at her familiar work table, but she wasn't alone. 6 small faces looked up at her with eager attention, Emma and 5 other children from neighboring ranches, whose mothers had shyly asked if their little ones might learn Mrs. Hartley's way with bread. "Now, remember," Clara instructed, her voice warm with patience. "The secret isn't in the recipe. It's in the love you put into every need, every fold." Emma, now 7 and confident in her role as assistant teacher, helped the younger children measure their flour. "Not too much, Billy," she cautioned the Morrison boy. "Remember what Mama says, bread knows when you're rushing." Through the window, Clara could see Jake working with the horses, occasionally glancing toward the kitchen with that soft smile that still made her heart flutter. Their wedding ring caught the light as she demonstrated the proper kneading technique, the pearl in her mother-in-law's ring glowing like a tiny moon. The bread classes had started by accident. Mrs. Patterson from the general store had tasted Clara's sourdough and begged for the recipe. But recipes alone couldn't capture what Clara did. So she'd offered to teach. 1 student became 2, became 6. And now, every Saturday, the kitchen filled with children learning not just baking, but patience, care, and the satisfaction of creating something with their own hands. "Mrs. Hartley," little Sarah Walsh piped up, flour already in her red hair. "Why does the dough get bigger?" "That's the yeast working," Clara explained, kneeling beside the child. "Tiny living things that eat the sugar in the flour and make bubbles. Those bubbles are what make our bread light and airy instead of hard as rocks." "Like magic," Sarah's eyes widened. "The very best kind of magic," Clara agreed. "The kind that happens every day if we just pay attention." The morning progressed with its familiar rhythm mixing, kneading, shaping. Some loaves would be lopsided, some overworked, but every child would go home with something they'd made themselves and the knowledge of how to make more. It was young Timothy Chen, son of the railroad workers, who made the announcement that changed everything. "My ma says you should charge for these lessons. Mrs. Hartley says in San Francisco, ladies pay good money to learn fancy cooking." Clara laughed. "This isn't fancy cooking, Timothy. It's just bread." "Best bread in the territory," Emma declared loyally. "Papa says so. Says it's what brought him back to life." Heat rose in Clara's cheeks, but before she could respond, hoofbeats announced visitors. Through the door came Mrs. Morrison and Mrs. Walsh, earlier than expected to collect their children. "We've been talking." Mrs. Morrison began without preamble. She was a forthright woman who ran her husband's accounts and didn't believe in wasting words. "This teaching you're doing, it's valuable. Our children come home different, calmer, more confident. Young Billy actually helped me with supper last night without being asked." "We want to propose something," Mrs. Walsh added. "A proper school, not just for bread, but cooking, preserving, all the household arts. You could charge tuition, have a real business." Clara's hand stilled on the dough. I don't know. Jake and I would need to discuss." "Already did." Jake's voice came from the doorway. He entered, hat in hand, trying to look innocent. "These ladies cornered me in town last week. Made a compelling case." "Jake Hartley," Clara scolded, but she was fighting a smile. "You've been plotting behind my back." Planning, he corrected, crossing to her. There's that empty building on our east pasture, the old bunkhouse. With some fixing up, it could be a proper schoolhouse. Close enough to the kitchen for supplies. Far enough that the young ones won't disturb the ranch work. The children watched with interest as the adults discussed their futures. Emma tugged on Clara's skirt. Does this mean more children will come? Will I have more friends? Clara smoothed her daughter's hair, still marveling at the privilege of the gesture. Would you like that? Yes, and we could teach them everything. Not just bread, but cookies and pies and, oh, the heartbread for special occasions. The heartbread? Clara smiled, remembering that first-shaped loaf that had drawn Emma from her silence. Now it was the child's favorite, made for birthdays and celebrations and any time someone needed to know they were loved. It's settled then. Mrs. Morrison declared, the Cedar Ridge School of Household Arts. We'll spread the word. You set the curriculum. I predict you'll have more students than you can handle by fall. As the women left with their flour-dusted children, Clara stood in her kitchen feeling dazed. Jake's arms came around her from behind, solid and sure. You're not upset about the planning, he asked. She leaned back against him. I'm amazed. A year ago, I was running from everything. Now, she gestured at the kitchen, the cooling loaves, Emma carefully cleaning the table. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else. Mama, Emma said thoughtfully, if we're teaching other children, does that mean I have to share you? Clara knelt before her daughter, taking those small, capable hands. You never have to share my love, sweetheart. That's yours forever and always. But don't you think it would be wonderful to help other children learn what you know, to see their faces when their first loaf comes out perfect? Emma considered this with 7-year-old seriousness. Like when I smiled at the bread and you smiled back. Exactly like that. The child nodded firmly. Then we should do it. Everyone should know about bread smiles. That evening, as had become their custom, the Hartley family sat on the porch watching the sunset. Emma was teaching her rag doll Sarah the proper way to knead bread, using theatrical gestures that made her parents hide their laughter. I've been thinking, Jake said quietly, about what you've built here. Not just the bread or the teaching, but... He paused, searching for words. Margaret would have loved you, you know. Would have loved what you've done for Emma. For me. For this place. Clara took his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and dedication. I hope I honor her memory. You do, every day. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing the place where her 2 rings nested together, his mother's pearl and his wedding band. She loved this ranch, but it was just buildings and land. You've made it a home. More than that, a place where people come to learn and grow. We've made it a home, Clara corrected. All 3 of us. 4, Emma announced, abandoning her doll to wedge herself between them. Sarah lives here too. Of course, 4. Jake ruffled his daughter's hair, winking at Clara over her head. They sat in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: bread to bake, students to teach, a ranch to run. The school would need planning, the old bunkhouse renovation, curriculum to develop. There would be those who thought a woman running a business unseemly, others who whispered about the former hired help getting above herself. But tonight, Clara Hartley sat between her husband and daughter, breathing in the sage-scented air of home, and knew that every step of her journey had been worth it. She'd run from a man who saw her as property, only to find one who saw her as a partner. She'd fled a life of obligation to discover one of choice. She'd thought herself broken, only to learn she was strong enough to help heal others. Papa, Emma said sleepily, curling against Jake's side. Tell Mama what you told Tom about the bread. Jake chuckled. Little pitcher has big ears. Tell me, Clara encouraged. Curious. He was quiet for a moment, then spoke softly. I told him I hired you to bake bread, but you gave us back our hearts instead. Clara's eyes burned with sudden tears. Jake! It's true, he continued. Every loaf you've made, every smile you've coaxed from Emma, every life you've touched, it all started with bread. But it became so much more. Love bread, Emma murmured, already half asleep. That's what we make, love bread. Clara reached over to smooth the child's hair, her heart so full it might burst. Love bread. Yes, that's exactly what they made in the Hartley kitchen. And now they would teach others the recipe not just for flour and yeast and heat, but for patience and care, and the small daily miracles that happened when people chose to nourish one another. The coyotes began their evening song, and somewhere an owl called. The ranch settled into its nighttime rhythms, peaceful and eternal. And Clara Hartley, once Bennett, who had traveled so far to find where she belonged, closed her eyes and gave thanks for burned chimneys and silent children, for strong men who knew how to be gentle and communities that lifted each other up. Most of all, she gave thanks for bread simple, ordinary bread that had become the foundation of an extraordinary life. Tomorrow, she would rise before dawn and begin again, as she had every day for more than a year. But now it wouldn't be a solitary act. It would be a celebration, a teaching, a sharing of the most basic and most profound human act, feeding one another with love. Home, she whispered into the prairie night. Home, Jake agreed, pulling both his girls closer, and in a kitchen that smelled of yeast and dreams. The sourdough starter bubbled quietly, ready for another day of small miracles disguised as daily bread. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. If you're enjoying these tales of frontier romance and resilience, we'd love to hear from you. Please comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. Subscribe to From Wild West channel for more heartwarming stories of love, loss, and hope in the American frontier. Share your thoughts about Clara and Jake's journey. Did their story touch your heart as it touched mine? Your comments help us bring you more of the stories you love. Until next time, partners.